Hello, and welcome to our module about foreign policy decision making. So far in this class, we've mostly stayed at the state level explanation, going down to group level explanations for why things happen in the international system. But today we're going to deal explicitly with small groups and individual decision making processes within the international system. So let's go ahead and look at our module objectives for today. So in this module, we're going to first be able to distinguish between different views of political psychology and international politics, right? What role does the individual have in international politics, right? That's their second one. And finally, we're going to describe how breakdowns in group dynamics lead to bad outcomes in the international system. Basically, this one's going to be really focused on the idea of groupthink, and we're going to dig into that a little bit later. So this module is a little bit different than some of the other ones we've done. So let's think about the kind of questions we're going to be dealing with for foreign policy decision making. First, right, and probably the most important thing we're going to be dealing with is how do leaders arrive at their decisions about foreign policy? And then what role do small groups play in the international system, right? Most actual decision making occurs in a small group kind of setting. We want to look at the idea of insanity and individual psychology and how that plays into actions within international relations. We want to look at some of the important psychological factors of international relations, right? What are some of the important parts of individual psychology that matter for international relations? And what is this idea of groupthink, right? How can groups end up thinking the same way and this cause bad outcomes? And then finally, how can the way small groups are made up change outcomes within international relations? So we've got a lot of things to deal with this week. So let's go ahead and just dive right on in. So the origins of foreign policy decision making, right? This approach to thinking about the international system go all the way back to a work by Snyder, Brooke, and Sapin in 1962 called Foreign Policy Decision Making. And in most traditional ways that we think about how decisions are made under foreign policy, right? We really think of the decision-making group as kind of this black box, right? And we look at this down here underneath of this graphic, right? We have inputs that go in, and then something happens, and then we get an output, right? We don't understand what's actually going on inside the black box. And what foreign policy decision-making attempts to do is actually get us inside the black box and see how this decision-making process plays out. So it's really concerned with the role of humans in the decision-making process. Right, we're trying to get within that black box, inside of the feedback control loop to figure out what's going on. So let's look at some of the elements of decision-making. So there are a lot of things that go into decision-making. There's your internal setting, right? How the internal politics of your country are set up, how your internal economy, right? All of the things that go on inside of your own country, right? These are your internal settings, right? How you make this, right? How you select leaders, how your economy functions, how large your military is, all of the things that are set up, right? And kind of make up the framework for your internal politics. Your external setting are the things that go on outside of your own country, right? The things that you can't control, right? The actions of other states, how other states elect their leaders, how other states have their own economies set up, how large their militaries are, etc. Right? So internal is what's going on inside of your country. External is what everyone else is doing. The actors involved in the situation are really important as well, right? Both the actors within the decision-making group and the actors outside of it, right? Actors are really important. So is the non-human environment, right? The geographic makeup, right? Remember when we were talking about why wars happen and all of those factors that go into making decisions, right? Geography, contiguity, to some degree regime type factors in here, economics. But right, these are the things that humans don't really have control of no matter what they are. When it comes to problems in foreign policy, there's also some other questions that come in, like how required is action? Do you actually have to make a decision here, or can you just let it play out? Right? How long do you have to make a decision? Right? The time dimensions here. How important is this overall decision? Right? The choice of whether or not to raise fishing limits in a fishery is way less crucial than whether or not to launch a military strike against another country. And also the way that you set up your organization is really important too, right? The organizational context of your decision-making group really have a lot to say about how these decisions get made. So let's look at some of these elements of group dynamics, right? Some of the things that really matter are which people you actually have in place, right? The personnel decisions that are made. Also important are the objectives, right? What do you want to accomplish with your group dynamics making? Within the group itself, right, there are some people that will specialize into doing certain things, and who takes care of what parts of the decision are really important, right? The internal specialization and division of the labor within the group are really important to how decisions get made. Who has authority, who actually is in control really matters, right? You could have kind of a group of equals, or you can have one guy that makes all of the decisions and maintains the authority and control, right? These are different ways of going about doing things. The motivations of everyone involved and the motivations of the group itself are really important to how the group's going to think. And the way they communicate is also going to influence the outcomes that they make. There needs to be some degree of formalized and routinized relationships, right? The way that people interact with each other becomes very formalized over time, and this has a good deal of impact on the way that groups make their decisions. We also see whether or not groups become very professionalized in the way they do things. Are they very relaxed in the way they make decisions, or do they have a very professional approach? And perhaps the most important thing is, where is the final decision point located? Who is the one that actually makes the final decision? Who has that decision-making authority? And where is that vested? All of these really heavily impact the way that the system is set up, right? And the way that decisions are made. So what goes in to actually determining actions? Well, one of the most important things is how competent your decision makers are, right? If you put the best people that are really competent at making decisions in place, you're going to get better actions and better outcomes. Bureaucratizing the system, on the other hand, right, can cause some severe problems, right? If you have a set process for making decisions, this can really skew the way that your decisions get made and end up leading to difficult outcomes, right? It can make it really difficult to challenge thoughts, right? If you just make the same decision every time, it makes it really difficult if you're actually doing something wrong, or if something unexpected comes up. It makes it really difficult to challenge those actions. The way that the group communicates and the way that information is spread within the group has a big role in determining actions and outcomes, right? If you don't have the proper information, or if you're not able to convey information effectively, then this is really going to weigh down the decision-making process. You also need to have some sort of feedback loop, right? You need to be able to get outcomes and messages into the decision-making system, right? You need to be able to update your information as it goes along. And you also need to be able to store information, right? You need to be able to remember what it is you've done in the past, right? Create some sort of organizational memory for the decisions that you've made and how you've made them, and determine whether or not those work, right? To be able to learn from your mistakes and actions in the past. But really what a lot of this comes down to is the motivation, right? Why does the group act the way it does? Well, this is where individual psychology is really going to come in and play a big role, right? We're going to see individuals within the groups have their own psychological problems that will influence the way things are done. And we'll also see individual psychology play a big role in the way that these decision-making groups are set up to begin with. So the motivations of individuals is going to be really important into the kinds of actions that occur. So there are certain typologies that people fit into within decision-making groups, right? We've got about 6 of them here that we're going to talk about in some depth, right? So the first major decision-making typology is the communicator, right? This is the person that goes around and bridges the gap between different specialists, right? This is your people person, right? You might have a decision-making group with a whole bunch of people that are really good at their individual thing. You might have an engineer, you might have, right, the politics guy, the economics guy, but you have to be able to communicate the information that each of these specialists has with each other. And this is the role the communicator takes on, right? They're the one that bridges the information gap between the various specialists. Next, you have the innovator, right? This is the person that's willing to take risk, that comes up with new ideas, right? They're the one that doesn't want to build off of precedent. They don't want to be drugged down by the past, right? They want to do something new, try a different way of making things work. Right? This person is the one that kind of pushes the group forward. Right? Kind of the opposite of that is the traditionalist. This is the person that says, this is the way it's worked in the past, right? We need to keep our precedent and stick to it, right? So the innovator and traditionalist often are opposed to each other, but the communicator tries to bridge the gap between them. You have your literalist, who is your strict rule follower, right? You set up the rules. They're the ones that make sure you stick to the way that you have decided to do things, right? Stick to the rules, even when maybe sticking to the rules isn't the best idea. The power seeker is usually, right, one of the negative people that can be in a group, right? They're the ones that have self-interest and want to promote their own role within the system, right? So they might not necessarily care about the overall decision that's made, but we can instead care more about their own role and making sure they come out looking good. And kind of the opposite of the power seeker is the career servant, right? They know their role is limited. They stick to that. They just want the group to do the best that it possibly can, right? They want to serve the entire group. So what you're going to see is that really good decision-making groups are going to have a little bit of everything in them, right? You don't want to become ossified by tradition or by following the rules, but you also don't want to be too much of a risk taker or a power seeker, because then, right, there's an entire other set of problems that can emerge there. So you really want to try to balance all of these within your different decision-making groups. So let's take a look at these groups now. All right. What I'm presenting to you here are three major models of decision-making groups. One of the more traditional ways of doing this is called the hub and the spoke. Interestingly, both FDR and Hitler use this decision-making style, right? The leader in this group serves as the hub, and he will go and consult with the various different spokes and basically have them compete against each other for time, for their efforts. And you end up playing the spokes off of each other in order to get to, use competition to get to the best possible outcome. And then the hub actually makes the decision at the end of the day, right? Picking whatever they think the best course of action would be. This can be pretty effective, right? This competition between different groups can give you a wide variety of ideas, but it also makes it really difficult to be organized and move forward. Right, the Nazis actually were not very well organized. They were constantly competing with each other. There was constant paranoia. So that's kind of the negative side of hub and spoke. The positive side was FDR was able to get all of his experts to compete against each other for the best possible outcomes. The second decision-making type is the small group. Right, down here I have kind of the King's Small Council from Game of Thrones. But this isn't just a fictional one. This is a very often received group, right? You'd have essentially a group of equals that would sit together, and everyone's voice has kind of an equal say. And then the leader there, right, in this case would be Ned Stark. But in real life, George H.W. Bush had a group of 8 very high qualified people that would serve as his decision-making group. This one's been pretty popular throughout history as well. It works best when the leader is more the communicator type. So this type can both be very good, or it can lead to very bad outcomes. JFK also attempted a small group decision-making group type in his early days of presidency. Right, leading up into the Bay of Pigs incident, the small group ended up working together to forward this Bay of Pigs invasion, which went very poorly. Everyone wanted to agree with each other. Everyone wanted to like each other. So there was a large deal of cooperation when there probably should have been someone questioning things. So this small group in JFK's time ended up leading to what's called groupthink, right? The group wanting to all get along, so they all just kind of agree with each other, and there's no one challenging ideas, so you end up with potentially very bad outcomes. Now, JFK learned a lesson here, right? After the Bay of Pigs, leading into the Cuban Missile Crisis, he assigned something called the devil's advocate, right? When everyone else is arguing for one thing, this person always has to argue the other side of things. Now, you need to trust your devil's advocate. In this case, for JFK, his brother, Robert Kennedy, served as devil's advocate. This is a very good way of making a decision-making group. Particularly if you lean more towards the small group style, it's very good to counter groupthink, to have someone always argue the opposite thing, right? To argue the rare case type. If anyone's ever read World War Z, the 10th man idea is kind of a variation off of the devil's advocate as well. So these are just kind of three of the main decision-making group types that are out there. There are some other ones out there, but most generally fall into these three kind of categories. So let's talk about some individual psychology here. All right, once we're in the groups, right, the role of the individual and the way that they perceive the world really has a large deal of impact on the kinds of actions that they take. So what we see are kind of two major ways of looking at psychology, right? You kind of got your big 7 over on the left and your big 5 over right? These are the traits that are really deemed as being important. This is kind of two different schools of thought. So for the 7, we've got these 7 traits, right? Starting with belief and control over events, right? Does the person think that they can actually impact the world around them, have control over their world around them? Or do they not? Do they think that they're just kind of a wash in the sea of history? The need for power. Do they want more and more power, or do they want to, right, basically not really care much about power? How self-confident are they? Are they a very go-getter, right, believe in themselves a lot, or are they kind of a shrinking violet? How much do they bias their in-group, the people that are like them versus everyone else, right? If you don't have a big in-group bias, you see the world as a pretty nice place. If you have a big in-group bias, right, you really only keep to your own kind. Task focus is also really important, right? How carefully can you stick to the task at hand? Are you really good at sticking to one task, or do you squirrel a lot and go off and do all sorts of things and not really are able to focus on a big problem? There's also this idea of conceptual complexity. Are you able to understand big, complex ideas, or do you like the world to be simple, black and white, right? That's a really important one there. And finally, there's distrust. Do you trust the people around you, or do you not? So that's kind of the big 7. That's one way of approaching psychology. These 7 traits really impact very heavily on how people function. This is much more taken, right? Europeans prefer this way of thinking about psychology. Americans, on the other hand, generally prefer the big 5. The big 5 are concerned with the idea of openness, which is kind of like in-group bias. Right? How open are you to new experiences and to new events? Or are you very closed? And there's conscientiousness. Are you thinking about other people, or are you thinking about yourself? There's extroversion, right? Are you outgoing, or are you an introvert, right? You kind of keep to yourself. Do you like to agree with other people, or are you okay with getting, right, kind of going your own way and going against the grain? And finally is neuroticism. Are you a little bit like unstable, or are you a very emotionally stable person, right? All of these different traits have different impact on the way that individuals work in groups and the way that leaders make decisions. So, right, just seeing these on their own doesn't really help. What we really need to do is start talking about psychobiographies. And here I've got 4 major examples of how individual psychology and group psychology can end up playing into major international events. So we're going to start talking about Joseph Stalin, right, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So Joseph Stalin, right, the leader of the Soviet Union, had sent his foreign minister, right, Ivan Molotov, to go talk to the German foreign minister, and they created a pact that said they were both going to invade Poland, but they weren't going to attack each other, right? They'd cut Poland in half, Russia gets one half, Germany gets the other half, and they would not attack each other. Well, Joseph Stalin was surprisingly a man of his word, right? He would stick to his pact. And as we all know, the Germans eventually broke the pact and attacked the Soviet Union. Well, once this occurred, Joseph Stalin had a psychological break, right? He wasn't seen for 2 weeks. He essentially locked himself in his room, had to rethink his entire world. And after this, once he finally reemerged, he came out and was essentially an avenging angel. He was extremely angry and mobilized the Soviet Union for war against the Germans and was not going to stop until Germany was defeated. So his individual psychology here, basically caused a psychological break and caused him to have a personality change. Now, that's not to say that he wasn't already a pretty harsh person, but in relationship to his relation with Germany, he had a huge change that he underwent there. So this really, this individual psychology really heavily impacted the way that the Soviet Union fought against the Germans. Our second case involves Mao Zedong of China. Once Mao had undertaken his 100 Flowers movement and his Great Leap Forward, it was realized that this was not a very effective way to develop the country. So a series of new leaders, pushed Mao out of the spotlight a little bit, and Mao was relatively comfortable doing this. He joined up, he had a personal train that he would ride around the countryside on, and he'd visit the people, mostly as a figurehead for the country. But somewhere along the way, in the early 1960s, he began to become very paranoid that people were out to get him, that he was about to be overthrown, that his revolution would fall apart. And he began to believe that he was constantly being spied upon. So in a paranoid fit one day, he broke all of the lamps in his train car, his personal train car. And come to find out, he actually was being bugged. His paranoia had some founded reasoning behind it. So in response to this, he began to wage a personalist revolution against China. He initiated the Cultural Revolution, having people vie for personal loyalty to Chairman Mao himself. That really destroyed a lot of China moving forward, and it took Mao's death to really begin to unwind the problems of the Cultural Revolution. So his individual paranoia, even though founded, led him to undertake what was probably one of the biggest disasters of the 20th century. In World War I, there was some family drama that played out. The leader of Russia, Tsar Nicholas, the leader of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, and the leader of the United Kingdom, King George, were actually cousins. Nicholas was far younger than George and Willie, but they'd grown up, seeing each other. They knew that there was a family relationship there. And in the correspondence between Nicholas, George, and Wilhelm, you see a lot of this family dynamic play out, How Nicholas wants to be taken seriously and is willing to invest very heavily in the war. So a lot of the actions undertaken by the Russians during World War I had to do with Nicholas's personal relationship to his cousins. And finally, coming back to our example of groupthink in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the group that had been put together for the Bay of Pigs invasion, John F. Kennedy's foreign policy group, they really all wanted to like each other. They were the smartest guys in the country, they believed, and they wanted to help each other and do the best for the country, which led them to make bad decisions. Now, luckily, JFK was willing to learn from this mistake and create a devil's advocate, make his brother the devil's advocate, so that when the Cuban Missile Crisis came along, while most of the group agreed that they should attack the Soviet Union, Robert F. Kennedy was able to push for more diplomacy, and this ended up being the correct call. We didn't have World War III, and the Cuban Missile Crisis eventually was diffused. So individual psychology can play a huge role in the type of decisions that get made in the international society. So here are your next steps. Go ahead and complete the readings from both EIR and ERWP. Complete your Module 9 quiz. Complete your Module 9 assignment. If you have any questions or comments, please post them to the forum. I'll try to get to them as soon as possible. And then go ahead and move on to Module 10, which is the first of our two-part lesson on international political economics. We're going to be dealing with trade and finance first. So thank you all for paying attention, and complete your lessons, and I will see you next module.